Okay, I believe we are live, and I just want to welcome everybody. My name is Eric Nolan. I'm running for Flagstaff City Council, and today I want to bring on a very special guest, somebody who is very familiar with criminal justice, as the topic today is examining the terms reforming, defunding, or disbanding the police, and what does that mean in the context of the world we live in today. So I'd like to bring on my guest, Dr. Luis Fernandez. He teaches criminal justice at the university here at NAU. And Luis, just first want to say hi and welcome you to the live stream.
Hello, everybody. It's good to be here to talk to you. I hope everybody's having a good evening.
Right on. So we're just going to kind of open this up more as an open conversation on the topic. I think more broadly just on the police, because, you know, we've seen, especially over the last 6 months, a lot of activity, a lot of protests out there. In some cases, there's been violence, but in the vast majority of them, there have not been. And I can definitely see that media is having an effect on how we perceive a lot of these things that are going on. And I thought it would just be worth the conversation to talk about these things. So what I thought I would first start with, Luis, if you're comfortable with this, is you were interviewed on a Phoenix news station where the host was asking to define some of these terms. So do you want to just kind of start by how do we think about reform, defund, and disband?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, just let me maybe just explain. I'm a professor at NAU. I study policing and protest, and I've been doing this for a long time. And this is what I've been thinking about for many, many years. And it's just kind of the topic that I'm really passionate about and that I really spend a lot of time thinking and reading about. I think that we know that this summer we saw an uprising that was just absolutely stunning. As a scholar, for me to watch was incredible. The level of intensity, the longevity of it, right? It was it was like 28 days of just nonstop all over the nation around Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd. And it's just absolutely stunning to watch something like that as a scholar, because I've only read about it at that intensity. I've seen them and I've studied them, but I've only read about that intensity in the United States because we hadn't seen that since probably, I was imagine, 67, 68, 69. And here we are with this experience, watching again and getting a sense of what that was like. And I've been studying this, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. There was a first wave, what I call the first wave, and then there's a second wave of Black Lives Matter movement. During the first wave, I was paying attention, of course, and there were many protests all over. And Megan McDowell and I, she was a grad student at the time, she's now a professor. We were like, hey, this is really interesting. Look what some of the movements are saying. They're starting to talk about the abolishing of police. And I found that very interesting because I really hadn't seen that before. So we wrote an article that's called Disarm, Disband, Defund, I believe is what it's called. And you can find it, but it's very academic, but you can find it online if you Google Luis or Megan McDowell. And the article kind of talks about this defunding and this abolition of police, kind of describing what social movements were engaging in saying, about 3 years ago. And what happened is that article kind of went viral. So that means that lots of people started to read it and it went all over the place. And then people end up asking me, thinking that I'm somehow ahead of the curve. But it was like, no, I was paying attention to the movements. And what happened is that the movements identify these concepts and these ideas. I wrote about it just reflecting what they said. And then all of a sudden they're up front nationally. So I just had a little bit of a heads up because I was paying attention to this a little bit earlier. So that's a long way of saying that these aren't, in a certain way, they're relatively new concepts, but they're not that new. Meaning that they have a history and they come out of very specific locations. They don't just come out of the ether or just drop and somebody just come up. It's like people in movements and in organizations and in nonprofit agencies have been thinking about this for a long time. And have been engaging in these issues for a really long time. So that's just kind of a little bit of a background. So and you can stop me anytime. I'm a professor, which means I can talk nonstop. So, and I know you know, because you know that, you know me. So if you want to talk about the terms, I mean, I think it's important to before we do the terms, to really kind of define what police is, and then define what the problem is that people see as a problem before we get to the solutions. Because I think reforming, defunding, and disbanding are actually solutions to a problem. So it depends on how you view the problem, how you define the problem, and then how you formulate the answer that you get to one of these things. And what I've been trying to do all summer is try to explain which locations you might come from and the assumptions that you make in relation to the quote unquote problem, and therefore why you would come to a particular kind of solution, right? So if we define police, let's assume that the function of police, if you think, well, let's talk about the problem. If you define what the problem is, so well, if the problem is that a disproportionate number of young people of color, and that includes mostly Black, Latino, indigenous people, right? In our area, indigenous people at a much higher rate. But if the problem is that those folks are getting killed at an incredibly disproportionate rate, sometimes when there's a criminal act, and many times when there's not, right? So many times when they go to reach for a wallet, or they go to open the door, or engage in something, they're perceived as dangerous, they're perceived as something that might be going wrong, and the police shoot them and kill them. This is going on all over the nation. It's not just here, or not just a local issue, it's a national issue in the United States. So if that's the problem, then the question then becomes, and if we can buy into that, and there's plenty of data that this is the problem. I don't have it with me, but I could, you know, if you email me, I'm happy to send it to you. But there's plenty of information and data that shows that this is true, and that has been true for a really long time. That this is not a new issue.
And if I can, just to jump in quickly on that, I do think it's important that people understand the key argument is proportionately. Because people want to make comparisons and say, like, well, if you look at the raw numbers, more white people are actually killed by the police than any other race or ethnicity. But then if you look at, but of the proportion of the white population or other groups, that's where you see there's a very big distinction there.
Exactly. So I wish I had, do I have the numbers in front of me? I don't. That was for a different talk. So you can see that there's a disproportion, but disproportion, it just means like if you are represented in the population, let's say 10% of the population, but when you look at the killings, you represent 40%. You know, there's like, something is going wrong, particularly there. In northern Arizona, the killing of young indigenous people is really, really disproportionate. Now, the actual number of killings that occur is relatively low. Relatively, not to say that it's low, but if you look at the percent, if you look at the number of killings in relation to our population, it's actually really high. So that means that we have a really high number of killings of indigenous people in relation to the population that exists, you know, in the region. Anyway, so let's assume that is a problem that we have to solve and we have to engage with, right? So that's part of the problem. How do we engage with that? Well, if you come from a reform position, right, the argument is going to be, well, you reform the police, right? And that is that the idea is that you engage in certain kinds of changes that will address the part of the problem that is in a part of the police section, right? So, for example, the argument for a rotten apple, there's rotten apples, right? So the idea is to eliminate the rotten apples, identify them, eliminate them, or do more training so that there's the killing has to do with misinterpretation of danger, or not really fully understanding what is really dangerous and what is not. So we got to retrain the police officers, or develop new policies, right? So now new policies where maybe you don't do searches, or just different kinds of policies in relation to that. Or you often hear develop, bring in more people of color as police officers, right? So that, or create in the leadership, bring in more people of color to the leadership, make the chief of police person of color, try to engage in those ways so you diversify the police, because in this scenario, what's happening is either lack of training or a inability to fully understand the concept of the situation, and you have kind of implicit bias taking the situation, so that then you are acting wrongly. So therefore what we do is we do training to make sure that they're not acting or that they're acting correctly, right? So this is generally the reform argument. This is the argument that the Obama administration took. This is an argument that the Clinton administration took, and in some cases even the Bush administration before that. So it's something that has been around for a really long time. So police reform is not new. Police have been reformed for 90 years, and in that process, there's been quite a few changes. So I don't want to dismiss reform as a dismissal. There's been some quite important changes in terms of the professionalization of policing. That's really important, right? So there's this training, right? So the idea is like you can do more training, you develop new policies, you hire more diversity, or you create maybe a community policing. There's a series of things that you can do. That's reform, right? When you talk about policing defunding, it conceptualizes the problem differently. We start with the killing. We start with the disproportionate number of deaths that are occurring. But the assumption with the defunding is that reform doesn't work. And that is that these killings have been disproportionate for a really, really long time. And that the amount of reform that has occurred has not eliminated the problem. So therefore reform can, so the best argument that I've heard is Alex Vitale. He wrote a book called The End of Policing. Is really good. And he also wrote some things on the web. And I found his argument kind of persuasive and interesting. In his argument, he says, if you look at Minneapolis, and if you look at just that situation, this is one of the big places where things really, the lid blew off, this summer. Really intense protests, really intense confrontations that occurred there. He says, if you back up 5 or 6 years and you look at what happened during the first BLM wave, it says that's also a location where things started and where things occurred. And then what happened was that the Obama administration came in and they engaged in one of the most serious police reforms that they've engaged in. And in 5 years, they retrained the police. They diversified the leadership. They created tighter use of force standards. They adopted body cameras. They initiated a series of community policing dialogues with the community, and they embraced early warning systems to identify potential police officers that may actually be out of line. And this is just a few. There's more. That was one of the most intense reforms that have occurred. And Alex Vitale makes the argument, if you look at that and then you look 5 years later and it's still, the numbers didn't go down, and there was again one of the most intense confrontations that have occurred. So he says maybe something is wrong here, and so let's assume from this perspective that reform doesn't work. Well, why wouldn't it work? Yeah. Right? Why wouldn't it work according to this perspective? Well, according to this perspective, it wouldn't work. By the way, just come on in if you want to.
I think it's good that we define the terms first, and then I feel it might open up for conversation afterwards.
Yeah. So why wouldn't it work? According to this perspective, then the reason that it doesn't work is because they identify the function of policing entirely different than the reform. The reform of policing is here to maintain social order, maintain, just kind of keep the peace, and we just need to change it in such a way that we eliminate the problems that exist within it. Within defund, the position is slightly different, and that is the police function not as purely, the police function to maintain the social order, right? So that means that the function of police is to maintain the social order, whatever that social order is. So that social order can be good or bad. At this point, it doesn't matter. The police job is not to judge the social order. The police job is to maintain the social order, to maintain peace so that the order functions in the way that it's supposed to function, right? If that's the case, then that means that under, let's just say, like segregation, the social order of policing is to maintain segregation. That's the social order in the 1950s, is that you have a situation where you have black people on this side, white people on that side, they're separated. That is by law, that is by, and what the role of police is to maintain and go, hey, you guys can't sit here, you got to move. This is not, you're disrupting this racialized social order, right? And that's the role of police, is to maintain this order, whether be it a healthy social order or not healthy social order. It's not their job to determine that, it's just to maintain it. So if that's the case, the argument that they're making is that under the current situation, the police is maintaining a racialized social order and a social order of inequality, right? So you have a situation where very wealthy people are getting really rich and other people are not getting as rich, and then people might be getting upset, and they're maintaining that particular social order because that's a social order that we have to maintain. And they're saying if we reform, we're never going to reform that out of the police, because the function of police is to maintain a social order that right now seems to be unequal. So therefore, the argument is, let's not reform the police, let's defund the police, because what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to shrink them. So instead of expanding the function of police or reforming the function of police, what we do is we need to shrink the police in such a way that it restricts the kinds of things that they might do. So some of the lowest hanging fruit is, for example, police are not trained necessarily, or they're not particularly the greatest to deal with mentally ill people, right? So you have many situations where people are having huge breakdowns, and a police officer gets there and the person is maybe kind of dangerous. It might be engaged in particular kinds of things, and the police is trained to secure particular kinds of things. And if they are in danger, the police officer can use force, right, and shoot somebody. And so we are creating a particular kind of situation where we're putting the police officers in the situation where the outcome might look like this. So from this perspective is, let's not do that. So let's start to defund the police in such a way that we grab that work where they're responding to these kinds of things, and let's have other parts of the city or nonprofit agencies or other communities respond to those kinds of calls instead of that. So the idea is to shrink the function of police in a way that might make sense in relation to what the police do. Police abolition now is way further out, right? So police abolition is these people are arguing that the function of police is really to really maintain the status quo, and the status quo is a deeply unfair situation, and that the police cannot serve any other function than the implementation of that particular status quo. So therefore, to really produce social justice in the world, we need to start by abolishing the police, because the police are the front line in relation to maintaining an unequal social order, and therefore targeting the police or dismantling the police as an institution, then is going to help us get to dismantle other institutions that create different kinds of inequalities of economic inequalities, racial inequalities, sexist inequalities, those kinds of things. So therefore, the argument is we need to eliminate that, because if we eliminate that, we get to these other kinds of inequalities in that. So that's kind of the three kinds of, I think, arguments that people were having this summer in relation to the kinds of positions that people were having.
Yeah, so that was a great way to define each of the terms, because now I feel like we can talk about it a little bit more relatively. So, for me, I'm running for city council, and, part of my representing the community is recognizing that we have a very diverse community. We have, that's one thing that I actually do like about Flagstaff, is that I can find pockets of different groups, and that to me just gives me a sense of who makes up our greater community. And that's where I really wanted to take a look at this idea, because I think what's happening nationally is really happening here within Flagstaff. It's happening wherever. And so one thing that I wanted to touch on is that we just had a city council meeting where the Flagstaff Police Department presented to council the practices that they have, the reasons behind their practices, so that way it's a little more, and I really thought they did a good job, transparent on why they function in the way that they do, in the sense that they have certain responses that they follow within their protocol. And that's what I think we're trying to get into deeper, because when you're talking about reform, defunding, or disbanding, these are under particular scenarios where the police are not serving the full function of ideally what we would want them to serve. And I think that's part of the issue that we see, like say in police brutality, where a situation is something that can now, you know, be easily caught on your camera phone in a video, where now we can all judge for ourselves based upon the video footage that we're exposed to. Oh, well, you know, clearly this person might have done this or that, but did he deserve to lose his life? So when we look at George Floyd and we look at an officer with his knee in the back of this guy's neck, like, it's one thing if you have to restrain somebody, it's one thing if you have to take him down, but if it has to be used in a way that force, lethal force, has to be used, that's where I'm kind of following in what you said in the beginning, which is walk that back. What led up to that particular moment where things went wrong? And what can we maybe do to avoid those moments from happening? So when you talk about reform, I agree that I've seen there's some trainings and things of that nature, but it does run a little bit deeper, because we're trying to look at overall, how do the police fit within a larger society that has its own operation, and what is their role in all of that? So with defunding, I know that when I first heard that term, like I admit it kind of made me pull back, because that was a new term for me. And I instantly thought, oh my God, if we don't have police, like I grew up in a fairly rough area, and you know, you're lucky if the police come around within an hour of calling them. So I've been in environments where, like, you know, it really is the lay of the land and what that mutual ethic is that ultimately defines your safety. So you would hope you build alliances in certain neighborhoods and communities that you feel like, you know, the people around you really do connect in a way that you're building a connection for your own safety. So when I heard your interview on a Phoenix news station on defunding, it helped to really educate me that, you know, the paradigm shift was, are we allocating resources or presage for particular pathways? So for me, I've always looked at, you know, education as a really useful tool that, you know, the more opportunities that we offer people earlier in life, they tend to avoid what would be criminalized later as behavior where, you know, for me, I was, you know, a pretty lost soul in high school going into my 20s. And if somebody would have met me then and passed judgment on who I was as a person then, it would be no comparison to who I am today. And it's like, do you want to lock this person up who was lost, who was making mistakes, and just say, like, you know, this is something society does not find value for? Or do you want to find pathways and opportunities? Because for me, it wasn't until I was 30 and went back to community college that I finally found something that was a pathway for me. And I'm not saying that that would be equal opportunity for everybody, but to me, that's kind of the goal. How do we offer those opportunities so people can stabilize, so people can find themselves in a space where that sort of desperate behavior that I exhibited as a teen in my 20s, there's no need for it. And that to me is where, you know, from my perspective, when I start to think of the police, it's a very top-down approach, and there might be a time and a place for that, but I don't think that should be the overall way to structure a society, because it has to be grassroots. You have to meet people where they're at, and I feel like that's how you build a stronger community, because now you're helping out the people who would otherwise maybe find themselves in a more desperate situation, finding connection, finding access, finding opportunity. And those are the avenues that I would like to see more investments in, because if you do the top-down approach and just say, we're the authority, if you don't fit in this box perfectly, then we're going to, you know, come down with the hammer. Like, how many times do we have to see that mistake unfold time and time again, that it creates a nobility? And every revolution, we could look at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, like there's a ton of revolutions that show this. When the nobility gets too high, it starts to collapse under its own weight, because you're not building a solid enough foundation with those who are around you in your environment and community. So I would just like to see, you know, better investments into how do we create a better condition for the overall populace, rather than this sort of top-down approach. So, yeah. I mean, how would you respond to something like that? Because I'm really trying to look at the whole thing.
Yeah, that's as big as it gets, right? because if you think of the disproportion of killings in relation to people of color, that's a symptom, right? That's not, in a certain way, there's things behind it that have to do with inequality, has to do with racial history in the United States. It has to do with the economic decline of the working class in general, you know, regardless of color and race, over the last 30 years in terms of the amount of money that they make. It has to do with a lot of different things that are much bigger. That's why, personally, I've always been trying to understand the abolitionist perspective in relation to how people think that if you abolish the police, you abolish these other things. I'm not always fully convinced, or at least I haven't been convinced, that there's a direct relation there. I need to understand what the link is. But that's to say, if the problem is a little bigger, if the problem is how do we maintain a situation that is democratic, that builds on a broad base of middle class, and maybe it starts to eliminate some of the class distinctions, that allows people to live a life of dignity and a life of equality without humiliation. That's much bigger than the police, right? That requires a thinking of how we structure society, how we structure a city, how we structure a state. Who we reward, who we take from, how do we redistribute? And those are really difficult issues, and they're really difficult, particularly right now, because we're actually in an economic decline where many people are hurting. They don't have, I mean, there's millions and millions of people out of jobs, and some people might be losing their homes. So there's many people that might become homeless in the coming year. Depending on what occurs with all of this. So then the question becomes even more poignant, right? It's no longer a grad seminar where we're engaging in this. Now it's right in front of us. What kinds of choices are we going to make in order to maintain and allow people to, you know, and then there are different philosophies on that. Some people say, hey, let the free market do that. And other people say, no, the free market doesn't function. Every time the free market engages in it, it actually destroys things entirely instead of that. And then now we're in the middle of a debate between those things. And my guess is that that's not going to go away. So you raised the big questions. I don't have the answers, but my sense is that they're going to get sharper rather than not. We're going to be talking more about this rather than less.
And I think that's why, for me, I want to engage this now, because, you know, for me, I'm just looking at the reality of the field that I see in front of me. And it's that climate change is here. We just went from a record-breaking high again this year to a record-breaking low within 1 week. So we are starting to see the extremities of what scientists said were going to be coming 20, 30 years ago. We're seeing that unfold now. Yeah. And with climate migration, that it's going to add more pressures, because we are at a higher altitude, and naturally that's what human beings are going to want to do. So in a lot of ways, I want to look at the social dynamic that we have in front of us now, place it in context with the history of Flagstaff, because, you know, the more that I've gotten out and have met people who've been here 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you know, it's important for me to listen to how they saw the small town that they once knew to where we're at today with 70,000 people and, you know, a wave of growth. And to me, if we don't figure out the social dynamics, and to me, if we do it through this sort of only look at it through a police lens, that to me is inevitably going to lead to violence. That is, to me, in my personal opinion and my professional, I just think it's the wrong approach. I think what makes more sense is to look at what are the underlying issues, what drives these things. So when I hear you talk about the different concepts, it seems like you're getting at the same thing. What creates particular situations where somebody's put in a position to react in a certain way? Yeah. So do you see this on a local level that, like I was mentioning before, the Cahoots model in Eugene, Oregon, that this is something that maybe it's looking at allocating resources to more social work, that, you know, we can start to qualify what an appropriate situation would look like for a social worker as opposed to a police officer?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that these are really, really difficult conversations at any level, including the local level, because it requires making choices that are going to affect entire sectors of a population, right? And that means that, you know, if you're talking about moving, you know, defunding the police, it could mean the jobs to certain people, and nobody wants that. I mean, we know that that's happened in education, where people lost many jobs because there's been defunding in education, right. and there may be more, right, coming because of the economic crisis. You know, so these are tough situations, things that we're going to have to face in every location. The conversation is just like now on policing, but it doesn't have to be only on policing. It can be in different areas. Yeah, but I think that these are going to be difficult conversations. I hope that they can be had in a right now it's very difficult because everything's so polarized that having these conversations becomes incredibly hard, because you know, I maybe speak like this, and all of a sudden, if you have like groups of people that say, oh, he really hates the police, we must have, you know, and you're like, whoa, I'm not that. I'm talking about engaging in policy and engaging in arguments. But right now, yeah, or the other position. Oh, Luis is, you know, loving the police, and look, he just wants to. He's not whatever enough. And those situations becomes much more difficult to engage in this. And I think that's kind of the situation that we're in. That the economic crisis, unfortunately, because of the larger context in the society, both because of COVID, because of the drop in income and jobs and everything that we're seeing, is polarizing us in such a way that I think we need to mention that there is a reality of white supremacy rising, right? We just saw in Portland people sniped 2 days ago from the Proud Boys. That is just frightening. I mean, it's just absolutely, to me, as a person of color, is like truly the nightmare scenario, you know. And we know that there's, you know, right-wing groups, Nazi individuals that are organizing in different parts, and I think that this is the larger context. And then we're then having to try to have a conversation in that context in relation to, well, what do we do with policing? And some of my fears are often, oh my God, if I say the wrong thing and I draw the attention of these particular groups, they're going to hurt me. And I mean that I think that's a literal fear, right, that I have, and that's a reality. Sorry, but that's to say that a city and the state are in similar positions where they're being pushed and pulled by different parts of a society that puts the situation, makes it very, very hard to come up with clear policy. And then the more that we simplify the situation, it seems to me, the more that we just go, oh, cops all good or cops all bad, the harder it becomes. Yeah. Yeah,
no, I totally agree. And again, it's something that I see as my role if I were elected to city council. I am attached to a governing body, but I'm also a private citizen. And part of what I can do as a private citizen is I can talk to people. So to me, a big role that I see myself playing on city council is facilitating these conversations, because I think in a lot of ways, I have, it's weird that it seems like it's so unique. I hope it's really not, but I can listen to different points of views and different perspectives and it doesn't trigger me. It doesn't put me in a state where I feel like I can't somehow understand where the person is coming from. And most of the time, what I've realized with a lot of the arguments that I've had, whether it's in favor of police or not, is that it's very deeply embedded in fear. And when people start to play off of those fears, now we're amping up something that is destabilizing in a way that it's not going to work out for anybody. I mean, we've had a revolutionary war, we've had a civil war. Like when too much of that starts to erupt, things start to break down socially. And that's where, more often than not, by far the vast majority of people that I have talked to do not want any sort of violent resolution. People want to figure this out. People want to get after it. The biggest gap that I see in that, though, is that it's hard for people to truly understand that groups outside of their own have a very different experience. It's a very different day-to-day reality. And until you really put yourself in those shoes to really listen to those stories, listen to those narratives, it's hard to understand why somebody would be for or against the police. So that's where that education part comes out. And that's where I really want to thank you for coming on, because having this discussion is, in my mind, just having everybody like, just put your weapons down for a second, like let's really try to have a conversation and see if we can get to, structurally, are there things that we can do to create equal opportunity for people? And that could even just be in terms of like, you don't personally feel threatened on a day-to-day basis. I have a lot of Black friends that I've talked to, and especially when Black Lives Matter came out, I really wanted to listen to them. Like there's a certain amount where, like a lot of people, you're just kind of getting to the routine of constantly venting, but it doesn't ever resolve. But I really wanted to listen to like, okay, well, once we get under that, how do you really feel on your day-to-day? And by far, like as a white male, it's hard for me to imagine this. Every single day you feel targeted. If you get in your car, you go to the store, you feel targeted. If you go to the mall, you feel targeted. Like just to have that level of anxiety, I don't think that's going to add to an overall benefit to what we're now trying to build in this modern context in terms of social dynamics. Because I do think we've entered into a new phase of different social groups having to blend in different areas.
Yeah. What I think, sorry if you hear my dog, I apologize. One of the things that I really tend to think of is there's been a decline in working class wages for, at this point, about 40 years. Or at least there hasn't been a rise. It's been really steady, just maybe going up a little bit in terms of people's ability to make a wage, which means that the middle class and the working class have stagnated for 40 years in relation to their wages, right? Flagstaff, they passed the $15 minimum wage. It's actually
Twice.
Twice. It's been absolutely powerful. It's had an effect on people's lives. Everything that they said was going to come through did not come through in relation to. Anyway, so it's good that happened here. In relation to that, I think it's real that particularly working class people, white, Black, Latino, Indigenous, have lost, not at the same rate, but they have all lost, and that many of the individuals that are classified as white that see a loss in their wages, it's a real loss. The only problem is that there's people fomenting tensions between the races, when the reality is that it's been the loss has been across the races. That is, that the working class and the middle class has actually shrunk, regardless of what racial category that you're in. Not at the same level again, but they have all shrunk. And you see this tension arising. And a lot of times I want to say, hey, no, yeah, working class white people, it's rough. They're losing jobs, they're losing ability, they don't have health care, they don't have those particular kinds of things. But guess what? It's not the Latinos' fault. Sorry, I mean, if you look at the numbers, they're also engaging in, they're also having that particular kind of problem. But because the United States has this racial tendency, we tend to racialize problems, and all of a sudden you got people against each other in those particular ways. And I think yeah. The other thing that I want to mention, I know we don't have a lot of time, is that there's one position that I don't know what to do with, that I've been reading about it and have been thinking about, and it's called Black pessimism. And it comes out of these scholars that are making the argument that the United States is based on a particular anti-blackness, and you can think of it as an anti-indigeneity or an anti-Latino-ness, where it is required for a variety of purposes to the violence on the body of the Black person and the indigenous person is a requirement in order to reinvent what it means to be American, or what it means to be white in that. And I know it's a long argument that I'm not going to have time to really explore. And I'm not saying that I agree with it. I'm just saying something that I'm having to wrestle with in terms of as an idea. And that is that perhaps this level of this relationship of violence, which actually goes so far back that when you begin to studying it, is not new. It just reemerges and then it just shifts and it changes a bit, but it continues right through the killing of slaves, through the slavery, the hurting of the body of the slave, through the movement of the indigenous people off of particular kinds of lands, and to the killing of them in the prairies and through the Southwest, the actual killing of the body of the indigenous body, through the segregation of the body in separating the bodies, through the lynchings that occurred through through the 40s, 50s, 60s, through the first half of the 20th century, through the killing of the police. That these are actually historically connected, right? And we can't say this leads to this and therefore this, but there's no denying something's up, and something's up that's been around for a really long time. And we just had one of the biggest revolts we've ever seen. And it's not just because police are killing young people, it's because this violence has been around for a while, and people seem to have had enough of it, and they burned down buildings and burned out cars around it. So
yeah, and I've recently been called out on Facebook because I had posted an article that came out that said 93% of the protests are nonviolent. And I know some of the concern that has come out is that, we don't want this violence. Clearly these people are wrecking shops of, small business owners that, like, what do they have to do with this? And why should they be paying a price for this? People destroying cars and things like this. And it's a hard conversation to have, because I believe that nonviolence is the path forward. I believe that if I put my effort out, that let's get after the problem and let's see what we can do to actually address it for what it is and improve those conditions. That's a nonviolent approach for me, and that's how I would approach the problem. And the backlash came where, well, you have to be able to denounce the violence then. And it's like, there's a part of me, of course, that wants to, and I want to say, like, no, you shouldn't do that, absolutely not, no violence whatsoever. But then I have to think back to, but what led that person to that moment of being violent? And that's where I go back, and particularly with this wave that I've seen within the Black Lives Matter movement, from my perspective, is that it seems to be mainly white, or maybe it's just that's what's making it onto the news. But what I've seen is that doesn't mean that all the people of color that those white people know are not thanking them for stepping out, because they feel like it's pointless. Why would I go out there? I would just get shot. I would just be further targeted. And that's part of where, okay, I don't believe in violence. I don't believe in property violence. But if you have people of color who are genuinely in fear every single day of their lives, then it does beg the question, should we just keep with this top-down approach where just squash out the violence and let's just keep it moving? Or take a minute to listen to where are these arguments coming from? You said something earlier about, like, reforming and defunding, and a lot of these terms aren't coming out of nowhere, because this topic isn't new. People of color have been talking about this forever. It's just now getting on the radar of the more general public, in part because of technology. I don't know if anybody could have really predicted that when camera phones started coming out, social media started coming out, the sharing of information, the sharing of communication, it made a lot more transparent in the world. And that, to me, is one of the new social dynamics, where we can't hide away wrongdoings. We have to confront it now. We have to be more proactive in how we approach these issues. And that, to me, is where I would not like to see further increasing in the funding of police, but more how do we look at the underlying issues and conditions that's setting it up for that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the violence question is just so difficult. And for me as well.
And I want to point out, though, real quickly, though, that the violence is against property, not people.
Yeah.
And that's a distinction.
And that's a very important distinction, by the way. I tend to not think of violence and property as the same. You know, I tend to think of violence as on the physical body, as the actual violence. I think the other one's destruction of property, which to me in my brain they separate because they seem quite separated in my mind. Sorry, but the question is really difficult because I come from Nicaragua. I came from a revolution that occurred there in the late 70s. And I grew up with, I saw a civil war, I saw a revolution, and this is why I study what I study. In fact, it's left a mark my entire life. And I, by the age of 10, did not have a romanticization or a romantic vision of violence. I knew young people that were killed during the war. I had family members and family friends that were killed during the war, and these were real things. And I knew that after the revolution, things weren't necessarily perfect there. So that means that revolutions and revolts don't necessarily solve, and all of a sudden we're perfect and we move. Otherwise, that would be great. Let's just do violence and then we're perfect, right? But it's not like that. So therefore, it complicates matters. It's left deep scars in my soul, my entire life in relation to that. And I think, but like you, I also feel like, wait a minute, sometimes revolts and really strong revolts are required, otherwise issues don't come up, right? I've been thinking about this for a really long time. And I even wrote, like I said, an article about it, that nobody paid any attention to it. And then as soon as people hit the streets and burned down a police station, all of a sudden, 6,000 people downloaded this article that I wrote. And that's not to say it's not about me. What I mean is like, look how quickly the mind changed. All of a sudden, what I was writing, that it was just purely on the side and not very interesting, it was just like an academic thing that somebody's paying attention to, all of a sudden became the center of an idea of what people were thinking, right? Again, I didn't create that. It's just this group of people created this ability for the scenario for us to be talking about this. We've spent an hour talking about this kind of thing that would never, I guarantee you would not be asking me about any of this if what happened this summer didn't occur. So I am aware that the engagement in disruption in those particular ways does that. It changes people's mind. Is that good? Is that bad? It's not like that. It's this weird dynamic, because out of those also come a dialectical response of the right rising up and starting to kill protesters. So now we have this. So protection, that's why I'm often thinking, good or bad. I just can't think in those terms. I think in terms of dynamics and relationships, and they occur in the social world in unpredictable ways. And my job as a scholar is to try to make sense. And the way that I do that is by trying to explain different kinds of positions so that at least people understand why they're disagreeing. It's like your fundamental disagreement is because you think the police, you in your mind, you construct police in this way, these people construct police in this way, and these folks construct this way, and that way there's a disagreement, but at least see that why you're disagreeing is these fundamental things. And that's the best that I can offer at this particular point. And then the rest is going to be solved in social dynamics that I have very little control over. And I think I get the sense that this is the beginning and not the end, meaning that we're in for a few years of pretty intense dialogue at many levels. And then, sorry, like you said, to add on top of this economic COVID, you got this climate change effect just right behind us. Spells for a difficult future.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on, because my whole intention is to facilitate communication, dialogue. Education is one of my just principal beliefs in life, that if we really just kind of had good quality education to talk about these tougher conversations, because I agree, if we don't engage this or something doesn't elicit it, then it's too easy to sweep it under the rug. So I really want to thank you for coming on, Luis. As usual, your insight is very wise, I feel, because you're starting to break down that we're seeing things differently. And if we can just open up that dialogue to maybe share those stories and gain perspective, that we might be able to figure out new paths to get us all to a better place. So I want to thank you again. If there's any last comments, feel free to go ahead.
I just want to say thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Luis. And to everybody else out there as well, I hope you have a good night. Take care.